Part 22. I Can See the Laws of Things. Author, Yitiao Xuanhuan. Chapter 211. Lin En was lying on the bed. He didn't know how long it took before he slowly woke up. But just as he was about to open his eyes, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his eyes. There was darkness before my eyes. At this moment, he felt a slender hand holding the back of his hand. Lin, you're finally awake, a familiar and happy voice came from beside him. Lin En was startled, and he slowly stretched out his hand towards his eyes. When he touched his eyes, he paused slightly. He felt a thick layer of gauze covering his eyes. The severe pain coming from the eyeballs still came one after another. "Where is this?" Lin murmured. The warm voice came and said, "This is the Hongduan Mountains in the western part of the Kyushu territory. Because there is a way to heal soul wounds here, I brought you here. You've been in a coma for half a month." The voice was very gentle, like a lark, crisp and reassuring. Lin fell silent. The power of collapse is simply too powerful. In just a moment, that force took away almost all of his mental energy. He still remembered that the last scene in his memory was that slender hand that was almost turned into bones among the boundless swarm of insects. Then there was a spring of spiritual power that allowed him to revive on the verge of being overdrawn. Did Kameng help him? Lin didn't say anything. He was silent, then reached out and took off the gauze over his eyes. But the moment he opened his eyes, he was startled again. Because when I opened my eyes, there was still darkness in front of me. It's not completely invisible, but at most you can only see a vague outline, hazy like a dream. Kameng's voice rang in her ears again. "Lin, your eyes may have been affected by that collapsing force, but it's not a big problem. As long as you take good care of yourself, everything will return to normal. I'll stay with you." Lin felt a hand grasp his wrist. Lin En was silent. The next moment, he suddenly raised his head, threw away the hand, left the bed, and staggered out of the door with the help of the ray of light in his eyes. "Lin," came the urgent voice from behind. The moment he walked out of the door, Lin's eyes were almost filled with dazzling light. He could feel the wind blowing, hear the chirping of birds and the sound of moving air, and smell the fragrance of fresh earth in the air. But nothing can be seen. In an instant, Lin stretched out his hand. Just like before, he tried to construct the will of law in his own hands. But as soon as he mobilized his mental power, before the outline of a will of law could be condensed on his palm, he felt bursts of pain in his eyes, making him unable to help but kneel down on one knee. He reached out his hand and touched his cheek, feeling the moisture. It's blood. It was scarlet blood flowing from his eyes. "Lin. Now is definitely not the time to use your strength." The vague outline in front of her grasped his wrist, and her voice was firmer than ever. "Otherwise, you may be blind forever." She already knew it vaguely. All of Lin's power comes from his purple eyes. But after releasing the power of Honkai that day, his eyes were severely damaged to a great extent. At least until his eyes have completely recovered, Lin must not use the power of his eyes, otherwise the consequences may be unimaginable. Lin En was silent, looking at the scarlet color in his hand, and said, "Are you taking care of me during this time?" The silhouette didn't speak, but Lin could feel her hand tightening slightly on her wrist. Lin En was silent for a moment and said, "Why bother? I have already told you that it is impossible for you to restore our relationship." The voice said, "I know, but no matter what, you can regard me as a friend you can trust, just a friend." The wind blew by. Lin En took a deep breath, raised his head and looked at the hazy sky, and said, "Oh, the feeling at this moment is really familiar." The silhouette was startled slightly, raised his head, and looked at the expression on Lin En's face. Lin En closed his eyes and said expressionlessly, "You have power but nowhere to use it, you have strength but nowhere to use it, you have an empty body, just like a waste, needing to be taken care of." A hint of ferocity suddenly appeared on his face. He stretched out his hand and punched the ground. In an instant, the whole earth trembled, and countless cracks opened directly on the ground. Even the terrifying cracks spread directly from his feet to the green mountains not far away. The green hills are crumbling. She knew that Lin An's strength had not been lost at all. On the contrary, after that battle, his strength had become stronger. Kimeng looked at Lin An's absent-minded eyes. For a moment, she had such a feeling. These eyes were more than just a power to Lin, they had a deeper meaning in his heart. How could she know? It was these eyes that gave him the power to stand up again and control his destiny in the face of adversity. These eyes represent his new life. Anyway, Lin and Kimeng looked at him firmly and said, "I will definitely make you recover, because here is the essence of life left over from the fairy era." The fairy era? Lin An was startled and frowned. Kimeng nodded and said, "Yes, I have never told you before that my mother is a remnant from the previous era. Their era was called the fairy era, and this is where my mother woke up." For a moment, Lin An remembered the small world where Dao Yi woke up before. After that small world collapsed, the spirits of that world handed him all the knowledge left over from their time. And that knowledge is now stored in his mind. I know. Lin An took a deep breath and said, "This killing of the so-called savior members was because they almost destroyed a shelter left over from the fairy era." Kimeng was startled. Although she had some vague speculations, she still felt a little turbulent deep in her heart when she heard Lin An mention this matter. Obviously, the place where her mother woke up was not the same shelter as Dao Yi. But in this world, no one can say how many shelters left over from that era have not been destroyed during the apocalypse. Lin An stood up slowly and said, "Take me there. I have already had quite a lot of karma with the fairy era." In his mind, there are countless legacies of that era. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 212. A few hours later. In a cave, Chi Meng supported Lin An and walked step by step to the deepest part of the cave. In the depths of the cave, there was a pond, and stalactites hung upside down from the top of the high cave. Tick. Tick. Drops of water fell from the stalactites, creating ripples in the pond. Chi Meng supported his arm, looked at the pond, and said, "Lin An, we are here. There are crystals set here by my mother when she left. Only the blood of the fairy human race can enter that ancient land." Chi Meng walked slowly to the edge of the pond, looked at her reflection in the water, and was stunned for a moment. That originally beautiful cheek is now mottled. That day, she was almost unrecognizable under the bite of the swarm of insects. No woman does not care about her appearance. Seeing her current appearance in the pond, she felt heartbroken, but what scared her most was not that she had lost her former appearance, but that. "What's wrong?" Lin An's voice came from behind. Chi Meng was shocked, shook her head quickly, turned her head and smiled, saying, "No. Nothing, I will open the barrier here immediately." Puff. A sharp blade of space gently cut her finger. When the drop of blood fell into the pond, it quickly spread out. The next moment, the surrounding rock walls shook violently. In the center of the pond, a space crack slowly opened. There was the entrance to the fairy refuge. Chi Meng turned around, helped Lin An up, and said softly, "Let's go." The road was very long, very long. They were like stepping into an endless space tunnel. Except for the echo of footsteps, no other sound could be heard. But for Chi Meng, this long tunnel is the most relaxing moment in her recent years. The revenge should be avenged, and there is no burden in her heart. But the most important thing is that she can walk here with the man she has always loved. She used to think that if one day, when they are old, will they support each other and walk in the park full of dead leaves every day. Even if they are gray-haired, if they can rely on each other for life. It is also good. However, who let this fate be unpredictable, so that this great road ahead has experienced twists and turns again and again. Even if it is a long road, it will be finished. We are here, Lin En. Chi Meng supported him and slowly stepped out of the tunnel in the space. They stepped into an open space covered with dead leaves. Lin En raised his head, and in his blurred vision, he could vaguely see an outline covering the sky. From under his feet, it spread all the way to the sky. What is this? Lin En asked. Chi Meng said softly, a tree of life that has lived through 2 eras. Yes, it was a tree that covered the sky. The tree was so huge that it was hard to describe in words. The two of them were at the root of the tree. Looking around, the tree spread all the way from their feet, with a radius of at least hundreds of kilometers. The huge tree tops pointed directly to the sky, stretching as far as the eye could see. If such a tree appeared in the Jiuzhou region, I'm afraid that even if you were standing thousands of miles away, you could see its vastness. This place was almost occupied by this giant tree, and from this, you could imagine how huge this small world was. Chi Meng took his hand and slowly walked towards the center of the tree. Her voice was particularly pleasant. When I ran away from home, I followed my mother's relics and went south and west. The first place I found was here. This tree is called the Tree of Life. In that era, it was called the Mother Tree. Here, I learned a lot about the history of that era. Since the end of the era, the powerful people of the Fairy Age, led by my mother, transplanted this mother tree into the small world, hoping that the symbol of the Fairy Age could survive the end of the era. They succeeded. The vitality of this tree is stronger than any other creature. It has successfully survived 2 eras. Not only did it not wither, but it became more and more luxuriant. Kimeng grabbed Lin En's wrist, smiled and pointed to a pond under the huge tree canopy, and said, Lin En, we are here. This is where I want to take you. A pond. A pond located on the roots of a tree. Drops of water fell from the high tree canopy into the pond, splashing ripples. Kimeng led Lin En's hand and slowly immersed herself in the water. Suddenly, Lin En felt a wave of coolness sweeping over him. Chi Meng looked at the pond gently and said, perhaps it is hard for you to believe that my talent in the God City was very poor at the beginning. It was because I soaked in the water in this pond that I was able to be reborn and gain a new life. Lin En frowned slightly and said, what is this? His perception of the law has become blurred due to the limitation of his eyes. He can vaguely feel the flow of the law of life in it, but there are many other unfamiliar laws that make it difficult for him to see clearly. Chi Meng said softly, I call it the fountain of life. But Lin, you don't need to worry, because I will never harm you. The fountain of life here will definitely be able to restore your eyes. Listen to me, it's absolutely true. Lin was silent. This is the first time he is unable to control his own destiny. For a long time, he said silently, I believe in you one last time. A sweet smile appeared on Kimeng's face, like the blooming snow lotus on Tianshan Mountain. She nodded vigorously, as if she had decided something, and slowly and tremblingly stretched out her hand to Lin En. Then he unzipped his belt. Lin En grabbed her arm and frowned. I'll do it, I don't need your help. Kimeng said in a low voice, Lin, you are injured now and have difficulty moving. Please rely on me for everything. You can temporarily regard me as her in your memory and let her serve you. Lin En didn't say anything. Just for a moment, some memory fragments that had been buried deep in his heart flooded into his mind again. Once upon a time, the two of them fought side by side outside Jianghai City. They have killed the most ferocious beasts, sneaked into the enemy's borders, and narrowly escaped with their lives in the hail of bullets. During those battles, the two of them established an extremely deep relationship and tacit understanding. And under this long-term tacit understanding, the two of them had long had a secret affection for each other. Lin En had wanted to break through the last level of relationship with her more than once, but in the end Kimeng always shook her head and refused. In her words, it was because she was not mentally ready yet. But other than that, they had already done what many couples do. Kimeng is not stingy in using other methods to solve Lin An's growing desire. Who would have thought that after so many years, the two of them would meet again in this way? Lin An's eyes went blank for a while, and he was silent for a moment, but did not refuse. Kimeng smiled softly, her eyes full of warmth. She slowly took off his robe, revealing his strong arms. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. I can see the laws of things. Author, Xuanhuan. Chapter 213. Under Qi Meng's guidance, Lin An walked towards the pond step by step and sat cross-legged. At that moment, Lin An immediately felt a wisp of indescribable power entering his body. That power made him feel very incredible. He faintly felt that the power was repairing the broken laws in his body bit by bit. Let his whole body slowly change in a new direction. This power is incredible. Lin An immediately closed his eyes and absorbed the power in the pond with all his attention. Qi Meng sat behind him, stretched out her hand, and sprinkled the essence of life in the pond over his whole body bit by bit. When her fingers brushed Lin An's back, she suddenly felt sore in her heart, and tears fell down. Because Lin An's back was covered with scars one after another. She still remembered that the deepest scar was a few years ago when they were ordered to eliminate a mutated regional beast at the border. In order to save her, Lin An blocked the blow for her. This also became a scar that he could never fade away. There is also a second one. The third one. Each scar is a story. She witnessed the past of each scar and experienced it personally. Now thinking back to the decision 2 years ago, she realized how painful it was to regret. Some things, when you have them, you don't know how to cherish them, and when you lose them, you will regret it. She finally understood the meaning of this sentence now. I will restore your eyes, Lin An. She hugged Lin An's neck and said softly. Drops of moisture fell from her eyes and dripped on Lin An's shoulders. In a deep tree hole. Qi Meng slowly pushed aside the surrounding vines and walked in. After many years, this is her second time here. She still remembers the scene when she first found this place when she was just a teenager. She clenched her fists and walked step by step to the deepest part of the tree hole. Child, you haven't seen Grandma for a long time. An old and kind voice came from the deepest part of the tree hole. Qi Meng slowly knelt down in front of the tree hole, kowtowed, bowed her head and said softly. Grandma Tree, do you still remember me? In the tree hole, countless vines with buds slowly grew out, and those vines gently lingered around Qi Meng. Just above the deepest roots of the tree hole, an old face slowly emerged. Of course, child, as soon as you stepped into this world, I could feel the blood of Qingxian flowing in your body. And you brought someone with you. Qi Meng closed her eyes and said softly, yes, Grandma Tree, I came here this time to ask you for something. The old voice came. Is it for that man? Kimeng pursed her lips and said, yes, he just experienced a life and death battle. In that battle, his eyes were severely damaged for some reason. If ordinary methods are used, his eyes cannot be cured at all, because his eyes are a little special. The old face was silent for a moment and said, child, who is he to you? Kimeng opened her mouth and blurted out, he is my love. Then, she was slightly startled, closed her eyes, and changed her words, he is a friend of mine, a very good friend. The old face looked at her, and the vines lingering around her slowly shrank and entered the cave. Child, you should take him back. I won't help him. Kimeng opened her eyes quickly and said, Grandma Dashu, I know you have a way. Even for me, please. The old face was silent for a moment and said, child, if he is just your friend, I advise you not to get too close to him. I feel endless killing and evil spirits in him. That kind of indifference to life makes me shudder. You shouldn't bring him to this sacred place, child. He is a killing god. There are countless dead souls wailing in his body. Even in the fairy spirit era, such a person will be feared by the whole world. Kimeng was anxious and stood up quickly, saying, "It's not what you think. He is very good. I can assure you that the one I know is definitely not a person who kills innocent people." After a long time, a long sigh came from the depths of the tree hole. "Child, don't let your emotions blind your eyes. Even though he didn't kill anyone for evil, I can feel that deep in his heart, he has long been bloodthirsty, and that murderous nature will sooner or later drag him into the abyss of no return, and at that time, he will truly become a beast that exists only for killing." Kimeng hurriedly said, "But, he has curbed that murderous intent." The old face was silent for a moment, and said, "Child, everything is temporary. Once a bloodthirsty person is infected with killing again, the suppressed murderous nature in his heart will erupt again, and it will be more difficult to control each time. And the best way to curb this murderous intent is to deprive him of his power, because the stronger the power of such a person, the more unstoppable the murderous intent in his heart will be. If you really want to save him, you should persuade him to give up his great power." Kimeng fell silent. Let such a proud man give up the power he has worked so hard to get? Wouldn't this be more painful for him than killing him? Besides, what virtue or ability could I have to persuade him? She sat there for a long time, motionless, like a birch tree. The old face stared at her from afar, and was silent for a long time. "Compared to him, what I care more about is where do all these scars on your body come from? You have a face that far surpasses your mother's, and now that you are gone, it makes me heartbroken." Kimeng lowered her head, slowly raised her hand, looked at the bumpy scars on her arm, and said, "Heartbroken? No, I am very relieved, because these scars at least prove that my feelings for him have never diminished with the passage of time, but have become deeper." The old face said silently, "What did you do?" Kimeng knelt there and said softly, "I saved him, but the price is that I became what I am now, so you should know that I will definitely make him recover at all costs." After a long time, the old face sighed and said, "Why are you doing this? If Qingxian knew that you—" Kimeng slowly raised her head and said, "If my mother knew, she would definitely feel relieved for me. You only said that you felt that he was a murderer, but the people he killed were all the murderers who killed my mother. They were a group of scum who were inhumane and betrayed their teachers and ancestors. If that is considered a crime of killing, then my hands are also stained with blood." The old face fell into silence. Kimeng said nothing, kowtowed to the tree hole, slowly stood up, turned around and walked towards the outside world. But just as she was about to leave, the old voice came from the tree hole. "I can help you, child, but you have to understand that the essence I have accumulated over countless years has long been consumed. In order to transform you, I have used half of my essence. If I give him the remaining half, I am afraid I will not be able to erase the scars on your body. Your arm will be restored forever, and you may always remain in this state, because you are injured." A gust of wind blew past. Kimeng turned around and kowtowed to the tree hole again, saying softly, "Thank you, Grandma Big Tree." After that, she turned and left the long cave, leaving only a long sigh. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 214. In the fountain of life, Lin An closed his eyes, sat cross-legged, and let the water flood his chest. Time passed day by day. Lin An had been soaking in this fresh spring water. Every day, Chi Meng would sprinkle the spring water over his whole body and cover his eyes. And for some unknown reason, from one day, this spring water had some obvious changes. The biggest change was that the power in the spring water that seemed to be able to repair the law became stronger day by day. The stinging in the eyes was also relieved a little bit. Every time the spring water flowed through the eyes, he could even clearly feel the coolness that seemed to flow in the soul. Grandma Dashu, when will his eyes recover? I don't know. His eyes are so special. Even in the fairy age, I have never seen such strange eyes. Even when my soul is close to those eyes, I feel a tremor. It seems that there is a real God living there. Real God? Yes, I am really curious. How can he have such a pair of magical and terrifying eyes? Those eyes are definitely not born in the mortal world. There was even a moment when I doubted whether he was a reincarnated God from a certain era. Actually, I don't know much about his experience in the past 2 years. Anyway, although it is slow, I can feel that the eyes are absorbing my essence. It is only a matter of time before they recover. Yeah. One day. One day. I don't know how long it has been, but Lin En has clearly felt that his eyes have improved greatly. The power in the spring water is indeed an indescribable magical power. Lin En, how is it? Is the spring water here useful for your body? Lin En heard Chi Meng's somewhat apprehensive question. Lin En wanted to reply to her in the same cold tone as before, but it was a little difficult to say it. During this period of time, Chi Meng's meticulous care for him made him feel an indescribable feeling in his heart. It seemed that there was a sign of loosening in the frozen part of his heart. Lin En shook his head slowly and stopped thinking about it. He reached out and gently touched his eyes. Already, almost. The next moment, Lin En raised his head suddenly. In an instant, he suddenly opened his eyes, and the eyes that had been dim for nearly a month were once again shrouded in dazzling purple light. It was like the revival of a sleeping god, and the laws of the entire small world trembled. The next moment, under Chi Meng's joyful and shocked gaze, Lin En soared into the sky and stood above this small world. He looked around the world, the rolling wind whirred around him, the flames and frost appeared and disappeared, the earth was rumbling and shaking, and even the space was constantly twisting and recovering. All the wheels of law he mastered cheered and rejoiced at the moment of his revival. Lin En took a deep breath, and his eyes instantly passed through this small world and connected with the sky. This feeling as if the whole world was under his control was back. This refreshing feeling made Lin En couldn't help but laugh up to the sky. The foundation of the entire small world was even crumbling in his laughter. An old face slowly emerged from the roots of the big tree. It looked at Lin En, who was like a demon god in the sky, with a complicated look, marveling at his terrifying power. It didn't know whether it was right or wrong. It didn't know whether it was a god or a demon that it restored. Its eyes left Lin En in the sky and looked at Chi Meng, who was standing by the spring and looking at the man in the sky with joy, and sighed for a long time. Child. Do you really think that if you give your all, you will definitely get the corresponding return? You have lost the most important face that can attract him as a woman, and even the power of collapse has begun to spread. You will soon lose the power to survive in this world. Lin En. Your eyes have recovered. Kimeng was extremely happy. When Lin En slowly fell from the sky, he ran over quickly. Lin En nodded and looked at Chi Meng, but this look made his brows frown instantly. Kimeng was wearing a white robe, and even had a hood on her head, revealing only her blue eyes. Her whole body was wrapped in the dress. And the most noticeable thing was that one of her sleeves was empty. Lin En frowned and asked, "What's wrong with you?" Chi Meng was startled, looking at Lin En's inquiring eyes, and turned her head in a panic, saying softly, "No. Nothing." She raised her head quickly and said happily, "Lin En, let's not talk about this. How do you feel? Are you feeling uncomfortable anywhere?" Lin En did not look away because of her change of topic. "Where's your arm?" Chi Meng bit her lip, slowly took a step back, and subconsciously turned her body to the side. But at this moment, she suddenly felt a breeze blowing past, and she subconsciously exclaimed. The next moment, she heard a crackling sound, and the dress that wrapped her whole body tightly turned into countless fragments in an instant. The strong wind blew those fragments away. The long hair fell like a waterfall. Chi Meng turned her head away quickly, hugged her shoulders tightly, bit her lips, and her eyes turned red instantly. She didn't know how to explain, and she definitely didn't want Lin En to see her like this. Lin En stared at her body in a daze. This woman, who should have been the most beautiful woman in the world, was now mottled and heartbreaking. Her fair skin was covered with dense bite marks. There was almost no intact place on her body. Her beautiful and unparalleled cheeks were now mottled and there was no trace of the previous one. Her arm was completely broken. From the perspective of the Eye of Law, he could clearly see that the power of collapse was slowly spreading along her shoulders to her whole body. Chi Meng turned around, her long hair covered her body, and her eyes were slightly red and she said, "Lin En, don't look. Who doesn't want to show their most beautiful beauty to their lover, and who doesn't want to show their ugliest side to others?" But at this moment, everything about her was exposed to Lin En, and she instantly felt a pang of pain that surged to her nose. Lin En was silent, and he said nothing. At that moment, he remembered everything that had happened before. He remembered the figure who faced the bites of the swarm of insects, the power of collapse, and brought the magic of heaven and earth to him when he was in a trance. Chi Meng wiped the moisture from the corners of her eyes and smiled casually, "It's okay, it's just a little scar, it doesn't affect my actions much. But it's very embarrassing for you to tear a girl's clothes so lightly. Forget about me, don't be so rude to other girls. Otherwise, they will definitely not forgive you. Also, I'm glad to see your eyes recover. In this way, there is nothing to worry about." Before she finished her words, she suddenly felt her body being embraced by two strong arms. "Thank you. I can see the laws of things." Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 215. These two words are like the first ray of spring water flowing down when the snow on Tianshan Mountain melts. Kameng's face still maintained the same expression as before, and she felt this powerful hug in a daze. For a while, I didn't know why. Her eyes just felt itchy and sore, as if something wanted to burst out of her eyes. She tried hard to suppress it, but in the end she found that she seemed to have failed. "No need." Kameng raised her head and looked into his eyes, trying her best to smile. Although the tone was so relaxed, tears still fell from those crooked eyes. Lin didn't say anything. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. When he opened his eyes again, his eyes were already shrouded in an even more dazzling purple light. At that moment, a lawful roulette was slowly constructed on his palm. The wheel exuded a dazzling light, and the moment he completed its construction, even the plants in the entire small world glowed with life. Even the big tree that stretched for hundreds of kilometers was growing vigorously at that moment. Vitality. Vigorous to the extreme. The face on the tree trunk stared blankly at the changes in the entire small world, at the dazzling green light bursting out from Lin An's hand. At that moment, it felt astonished that its soul was completely blank. "That's what?" In the boundless light, Lin An slowly covered Kameng's forehead with his hand. Kameng was also shocked by this indescribable vitality, but before she had time to ask, she immediately felt the majestic vitality pouring into her body. It's like the first green grass that slowly pokes its head out of the soil in early spring. Under the baptism of indescribable coolness and warmth, all the scars on her body began to heal at that moment. The scars receded little by little, and her skin became brighter and more attractive. The originally broken arm slowly emerged as a new outline amid the indescribable vitality. Just like a newborn baby, in the boundless light, all her ugliness has faded away. A breeze blew. The majestic light disappeared in an instant, her long waterfall-like hair fell with the wind, and her body was as crystal clear as a crystal that had just been carved. Her body recovered. And it is even more perfect than before, with not a single flaw on his body. It is so moving that even the stars in the sky will be dimmed. Even because it is so perfect, her body looks unreal, like an elf of nature that should not exist in this world. Kemeng stared blankly at the changes in her body, and slowly raised her hand. The skin, which was fairer and smoother than a baby's, made her feel a little unreal. It's like a dream. Lin. She said in a daze, how could? And at the next moment, she suddenly felt a spin, and she was directly picked up by Lin En. She let out an exclamation, and subconsciously hugged Lin En's neck to maintain balance. Lin, she was a little flustered, and her heart felt like it was about to jump out. Even a few years ago, she had never been naked with him like she was now. A trace of blush appeared on her cheeks and white neck almost at that moment. She vaguely felt what Lin En was going to do, but she never thought that it would be at this time and in this way. This made her mind go blank, and her frightening eyes could only dodge in panic, and she could only hug Lin En's neck tightly. Lin, you. Lin whispered in her ear, don't even think about running away again. If you run away again, I will break your legs. For a moment, Kemeng was stunned. Kemeng stared into his eyes blankly, and for a moment, she couldn't say a word. Suddenly, she didn't know where the courage came from. Kemeng bit her lip, suddenly raised her white neck and pressed her lips against it. Not anymore. I will never run away again. A few hours later, Lin En stood on the roots of the tree, looking into the distance in the whistling wind, lost in thought. Kemeng's body was covered with a dark robe, and her waist-length hair flowed down from behind her like a waterfall. The long robe covered her graceful figure, but when she walked around, she could still see those breathtaking eyes. Long legs. Lin, what are you thinking about? Kemeng grabbed the collar of her robe, blinked, turned her head in confusion, and looked at Lin's expression. Traces of the violent storm still remained on her face, and purple bruises could be faintly seen on her long and white neck. She never dreamed that she would complete her transformation from a girl to a woman here. All of this was so unreal that it even felt like a beautiful dream to her. Lin En looked into the distance, slowly stretched out his hand, touched his eyes, and said, "These eyes have given me the power to subvert the whole world. I have always been proud of them and regard them as a shortcut to my journey to heaven. But as time goes by, I have also discovered that I can't shake off the influence these eyes have on me." Kemeng was startled and looked at Lin En's face. She didn't know what to say, so she had to reach out and grab 3 of his fingers. Lin En said solemnly, "These eyes have always been sending me a signal. They told me that one day, I will stand above all the heavens and become the new god of this world, but it did not tell me what price do I have to pay. If becoming a god means annihilating humanity and emotions, then will I still be me at that time?" Lin En took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and said, "I have always thought that I controlled these eyes. Now it seems that I am afraid that I have unknowingly lost myself in the power they gave me. Let's get over ourselves." Kemeng shook his hand and said softly, "No, I believe you." Lin En smiled faintly, stretched out his hand, tore off a strip of cloth from his clothes, and covered his purple eyes. Kemeng was startled and asked, "Lin, what are you?" Lin En said slowly, "I rely too much on the power these eyes bring me. If I encounter opponents who can really fight with me, these eyes will become my biggest flaw, because I lose without the power given to me by these eyes, I am nothing." Lin raised his head and said, "I must gradually get rid of my dependence on these eyes, so that even if my eyes become unusable again, I will still have the strength to fight." Kemeng stared blankly at Lin En's side face. He has indeed changed a lot. If he was obsessed with power before, now he can examine his relationship with power from a more detached perspective. This way, he is even more powerful than the crazy and indifferent Lin En before. She didn't know why, but she just felt that Lin An was so handsome at this moment. So handsome that I want to cry. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. I can see the laws of things. Author, Xuanhuan. Chapter 216. Kimeng smiled, and that beautiful smile could make many men in the world fall in love with it. In this case, let me teach you how to practice swordsmanship. My swordsmanship is a secret from my mother. In the fairy era, this set of swordsmanship was enough to be at the forefront of the times. It took me half a year of practice to barely master it. Do you dare to challenge my record? Lin An raised the corner of his mouth and said, "Oh, there is no skill in this era that I, Lin An, cannot master." Kimeng said with a smile, so arrogant. "Okay. Then let's make a bet. If you can't master the basic essentials of swordsmanship I teach you within a month, you must agree to one condition." Lin crossed her shoulders and said, "What if I can?" Kimeng moved her bright eyes and said slyly, "You can play whatever you want." Lin An raised the corners of his mouth and said, "Oh, don't complain about pain when the time comes." Kimeng was startled and immediately understood the meaning of Lin An's words. Her face was instantly covered with a layer of crimson. She turned her head and said, Who shouted?" Lin didn't waste any time. "Their training begins immediately after noon." After his eyes recovered, his perception ability had also been fully restored, and his closed eyes did not affect his actions at all. Under the powerful perception, as long as Lin An is willing, he can clearly see every move within a radius of hundreds of kilometers. Even after his vision was cut off, his perception became even sharper. He could clearly feel everything from the howling of the wind in the sky to the falling of a drop of dew 100 kilometers away. "Lin, look at the sword." In an instant, a beautiful shadow flew from behind him. Her speed was so fast that she even left after images on the spot. Phew! 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 The sword energy bursting out from the sharp sword blade actually tore the space apart. The corner of Lin An's mouth curled up. Just when her sword blade was just a few millimeters away from piercing his back, Lin An suddenly turned around, and the wooden sword in her hand dinged, directly colliding with Kimeng's sword blade. Kimeng screamed in surprise, and the majestic force directly broke her sword blade, causing her to fly away. His speed was so fast that he was a level above her. But this is only one aspect. The most important thing is his control and understanding of the swordsmanship. On the first day, Lin An could only barely complete a set of basic sword skills. But the next day, he was able to put it to practical use. But it was only the third day of teaching. Lin An was already on par with her when using the same sword skills. Kimeng suddenly adjusted her posture, did a backflip, and landed gently on the ground. She looked at the broken sword in her hand in shock and murmured, "This is impossible. In just 3 days, you have already mastered the first stage of the swordsmanship to the point of mastery. You are lying." Lin An closed his eyes and said slowly, "The moment I engraved the will of heaven on my body, I was already extraordinary. Things like understanding and talent are already dispensable to me. Do you think you understand? Is it difficult to construct laws, or is it difficult to master a set of mortal swordsmanship?" Kimeng was speechless and speechless. That's right. After coming into contact with the law, in Lin's eyes, nothing in this world could stump him. Just like a top genius who has already mastered advanced mathematics, if he is allowed to come into contact with the linear equation of two variables, if he cannot learn this, then he might as well die. Lin An can even master high-level things like laws. Swordsmanship. Ridiculous. Come again. Lin An suddenly turned around, raised his head, and said, "Use all the sword skills you have learned in the past few years. I will understand them all within 2 days." If the top bosses of Fairy's era heard these words, they would probably crawl out of their coffins and fight him desperately. The set of swordsmanship that Kimeng now masters is also one of the top 10 swordsmanships in the Fairy era. He really treats the swordsmanship as rubbish. You will learn it as soon as you learn it. But the fact is that he can really learn it once he learns it. Kimeng was also a little bit angry, and said angrily, "Lin, please respect the results of my hard work over the years. How could you learn it so quickly? This must be done step by step." Lin An raised his head and said, "That's for ordinary people like you. In my dictionary, there is no step-by-step approach." Kimeng had no choice but to follow Lin An's wishes and stop teaching one lesson at a time. Although she did admit that Lin An's talent was terrifyingly high, it was a bit exaggerated to learn this entire top-level swordsmanship in 2 days. 2 days later, Kimeng, who was dressed in black robes, stood blankly at the edge of the open space, and even the sword blade in his hand fell out of his hand and fell to the ground. In the open space, Lin An's eyes were covered with black cloth, and the wooden sword in his hand turned sharply, cutting out after images in the air. Even using an ordinary wooden sword can cause large fluctuations in the surrounding space. The next moment, countless leaves were flying. Lin An's eyes flashed, and the wooden sword in his hand quickly slashed at the flying leaves. After only a 10,000th of a second, Lin An had already put away his sword and stood up. There was a crisp scream from the wooden sword. He raised his head and said calmly, "This set of swordsmanship is pretty good, you can use it." Kimeng looked blankly at the fluttering leaves. She instantly saw that among the thousands of leaves, each leaf had a scroll carved into its veins. Each leaf had at least hundreds of scrolls, and the countless scrolls were connected together. Turned out to be a painting. Kimeng murmured dully, "Qingming, Shanghe picture. This can no longer be described in words. How fast is this, and how amazing is the control over the details of the blade, to be able to reach such a terrifying level." Kimeng suddenly felt that the swordsmanship she was so proud of was so poor at this moment. It was so clumsy that she even had the idea of giving up this swordsmanship. Even the Tree of Life, which had been watching them silently these past few days, stayed there in shock, speechless for a long time. It has gone through the entire fairy age and the end of the world. When it comes to this era, the geniuses it has seen are like the vast galaxy. But at this moment, she actually felt that her vision was still limited. "Inhuman," the big tree murmured. Lin An slowly turned his head, faced Kimeng, and said with a raised corner of his mouth, "You seem to have lost." Kimeng still hadn't recovered from the huge shock, but she immediately felt a male breath coming towards her face. The next moment, she felt a lightness in her body, and she was picked up by Lin An again. Kimeng suddenly panicked and said, Lin An, don't be here, I was just talking casually." Lin An smiled lightly and said, "I don't like girls who don't keep their words." But, ah. The face on the tree trunk slowly closed its eyes, shook the tree trunk, and sighed. "Hey, young man. I can see the laws of things." Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 217. Time passes day by day. After Lin An learned Kimeng's top-level swordsmanship, he was still not satisfied. Because his pursuit of power will never end. On the second day after finishing the game with Kimeng, Lin An came to the clearing again. This time, what he wanted to practice was the countless martial arts books left over from the entire fairy era in his mind. In his mind, it was like a treasure trove of classics covering the entire era. After eliminating a large number of techniques that were too low-level or no longer suitable for this world due to changes in the times, Lin An screened a total of 25,000 combat techniques. These include top-notch spells from dozens of systems such as supernatural powers, swordsmanship, and spiritual arts. The next moment, Lin An raised his head and said slowly, "Heh, it doesn't seem to be very difficult. In the next few days, The only thing Kimeng could do was sit on a tree trunk not far from the clearing, hugging her legs and staring blankly at Lin An's practice as if he was cheating. That kind of dazzling speed, that kind of combat skills that make people unable to take their eyes away, feels as unreal as a dream. I don't know when it started, but the old face appeared next to the tree trunk where Kimeng was sitting. It stared at Lin An in astonishment like Kimeng, day after day. "Child, where did you get to know such a monster?" Dashu murmured. "The spells he practiced seemed to be the top spells that became famous in our time, but why is it in his hands? Here, why do I feel like he is eating jelly beans?" Kimeng hugged her knees and murmured, I don't know either." Dashu murmured, "Fortunately, he was not born in the age of fairies. If he was born in the age of fairies, I am afraid that all our geniuses will be suppressed and unable to hold their heads up for the rest of their lives." On the one hand, it was shocked by Lin An's terrifying talent, but on the other hand, he was also puzzled by the countless spells that Lin An had learned that belonged to the fairy age. It has always been in this small world. Although it knows that times have changed, it is not very clear about what it is like outside. Could it be that the remnants of the fairy era have already taken root in this era? Could it be that the cultivation system of the fairy era has become a ubiquitous street stall in this era? Less than half a month passed. The entire open space has sunk down hundreds of meters due to Lin An's continuous practice. Even because Lin practiced at this place every day, the entire small world was squeezed and changed in his direction. In the past half-month, Lin's terrifying energy has supported him, allowing him to practice faster and faster. Even in the end, people had to wonder whether his mental power had surpassed that of a world-class magic god. Finally, on the 15th day, Lin's sword blade made the final stroke. He raised his head and said slowly, "I have almost mastered what I should master." In these 15 days, he did not master all the 25,000 spells. Instead, he got rid of the dross and messy things, only took the essence, and integrated them all. He integrated all the 25,000 techniques into his sword blade. At this moment, I am afraid only he knows how powerful Lin An has become. "Come out." Lin An slowly sheathed the sword, turned around and said, "I know you have been watching me, and I am grateful that you healed my eyes. If you have anything to ask, just ask." The old face slowly appeared on the tree trunk not far away. Lin An sensed the difference of this big tree from the beginning. The biggest difference from ordinary plants was that Lin An saw the will of soul in the body of this big tree. It has a soul, which means it has its own consciousness. The old face looked at Lin An complicatedly and said, "I originally thought you were just a relatively powerful human being, but I never expected that you would be so powerful. You are really beyond expectations." "My expectation?" Lin An said calmly, "There is no need to say compliments. I know you have a lot of questions." The old face said deeply, "Yes, my biggest question is, where did those spells you learned come from? If I guessed correctly, those spells should all belong to our fairy age." Lin An raised his head, and for a moment, he recalled in his mind the scene when the small world collapsed, and the fragmented spirit body entrusted him with the inheritance of the entire fairy era. Lin An took a deep breath and said, "Yes, those are all your inheritance. I accepted the gift from a small world spirit body, so I got countless knowledge and treasures of your era." The old face was shaken, and the entire tree crown swayed. "What?" A few hours later, in a deep tree hole, Lin An slowly raised his head and said, "This is all the things I have experienced about the fairy age. What I should say has been told to you." Lin An told this tree of life everything from the beginning of his understanding of Tao to the collapse of his small world. After hearing this, the face on the tree trunk fell into a long silence. Especially when it heard what the spirit of the small world said to Lin An, its emotions, which had not been turbulent for hundreds of thousands of years, were difficult to calm down for a long time. The collapse of the era. The decline of the fairy era. The last remnants of the fairy race fell apart. I know its vicissitudes of life came, with deep loneliness. I think our two small worlds should be the last two refuges that have survived the fairy era. Lin N, thank you very much for telling me this. After King Xuan's death, Dai is probably the only human with the orthodox fairy bloodline. If you see him again, please tell him to live well in this era with the legacy of the entire fairy era. Lin N nodded and said, I will. The old face looked at Lin N and said, I can feel that you also have a lot of questions in your heart. Do you have anything to ask me? Lin N thought for a moment, raised his head and looked at the old face. To be honest, he did have a lot of questions in his heart. His understanding of that ancient and mysterious era was limited to the information he got from Dai's small world. I want to know. Lin N asked, what are you? How much do you know about the fairy age? The old voice echoed throughout the tree hole. I have existed for an unknown period of time, millions of years, tens of millions of years, or perhaps even longer. I am a tree species that was planted at the beginning of the fairy age, but in fact, it was not until the end of the era that I gradually awakened my own consciousness. A large part of my memories of that era still remain in the period before the outbreak of the doomsday. A tree of life that has survived the entire fairy age and has lived to their era. It may be the oldest living fossil known in the world now. Second question. Lin An thought for a moment, raised his head and looked at it deeply and said, will the collapse of the world really come? I can see the laws of things. Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 218. Ever since he got the concept of world collapse from the spirit body in that small world, more and more puzzles have arisen. About the end of the fairy age, and her warnings of the great collapse. It all sounds so ridiculous. According to a normal person's thinking, it is absurd to believe in these unfounded predictions. But Lin had to find out. Because once the big collapse she talks about comes true, then their entire era will face a huge crisis. Lin An said deeply. Although I really want to believe what the spirit told me, the world has not shown any signs of collapse so far. Although wars and battles have been happening, it is far from shaking the foundation of the world. So I have always been doubtful. I don't know if you can give me an answer. The old face was silent. For a long time, its voice echoed throughout the tree hole. Lin, none of us know whether the collapse of the world will come. Even in the age of fairies, the collapse of the world was considered extremely ridiculous in the hearts of many people. But if it has not come now, it does not mean that the collapse of the world will come. It means it's not going to happen and we have to be fully prepared for it. Because this prophecy is the only warning left after the end of one era after another. Lin An was startled and said, you mean, this prophecy existed long before your fairy age? The face nodded and said, yes, although I only gained my own consciousness at the end of the fairy age, there is a mark in my body that keeps reminding me that my existence itself is for the great things that may happen in the future. One of the insurances left behind by the collapse. As soon as these words came out, Lin An was shocked and said, one of the insurance policies. There was a confused look on that face, and he said, yes, I have been guessing that that mark is most likely left by the existence that planted me in the first place. I vaguely felt it in that mark. A corner of a grand plan, a response plan prepared for the coming of a big collapse that lasted for an unknown amount of time. It said deeply, do you know what the big collapse means? Lin An frowned and said, when the laws of the world completely collapse, at that time, everything will turn into nothingness, because a world without laws will have no meaning. The face said deeply, yes, do you know that the ability I have is to repair the law of life? I have the ability to complete the law of life. I cured the collapse of your eyes. In a sense, I can prevent the collapse of some laws, so I firmly believe that when the big collapse comes, my mission is to fill in the collapsed laws of life. As soon as he said this, Lin stood up suddenly. Complement the law of life. Lin vaguely thought of the entire grand plan it spoke of through its words. If it is just one of the countless insurances set up to deal with the big collapse, can it be said that its role is to repair the collapse of the law of life when the big collapse comes? What about other laws? Does it mean that in this grand plan, there are many means prepared to deal with the collapse of other laws? If this is really the case, then the grandeur of this plan is simply beyond imagination. This is a joint effort of countless eras that spreads into the distant future. Complete the plan. Lin An suddenly raised his head and said, "So, does that mean that there are other insurance measures like yours in our world that are prepared for the coming of a big collapse?" The face shook his head and said, "I don't know, maybe they really exist, but who can guarantee that after experiencing the collapse of eras again and again, whether they will be annihilated in the long river of time, but compared to regarding them, I actually care more about." It looked deeply at Lin An and said, "You." Lin An was startled and said, "Me?" The face looked at him deeply and said, "That's right, those eyes of yours make me feel scared. Did you use the law of life to heal Kimeng's injuries before?" Lin An narrowed his eyes and said, "That's right." The face spoke and said, "Sure enough, the moment you used the law of life, I had that strange feeling, because my own existence is to repair the law of life, but I want to repair the law of life unless I sacrifice the whole thing, otherwise it can only run through the essence accumulated over countless years. But you have so easily made up for the broken law of life in Kimeng's body. This terrifying power makes me tremble, and what makes me feel most incredible is that you may be able to use more than just this kind of law of life." At this point, Lin An no longer wanted to hide it. He slowly stretched out his hand, touched his eyes, and said slowly, "Yes, my eyes give me the ability to control the laws of all things, so sometimes, I really regard myself as a god." As soon as he said this, the face fell into silence. Although it had some vague speculations, when it heard Lin An admit it personally, the shock was still unimaginable. Having the ability to control the laws of all things, if this kind of power is not God, what is it? If this is really the case, could it be that he, like me, is part of that grand plan? But at this moment, he suddenly remembered something else. "Lin, I feel incredible, but what I care about now is another thing." He looked at Lin deeply and said, "How did the laws inside you and Kimeng collapse? Is there some sign of a big collapse in this era? This is something it can't figure out clearly." When the two of them first came here, they felt the power of law-breaking flowing in their bodies. This even caused its body to react extremely violently. This makes it feel scared. It must understand the cause of the collapse. If it is really a sign of the coming collapse, then the world may really be facing unimaginable bad news. Lin An shook his head, raised his head with some confusion, and said, "That is also my power." Dashu was startled and said, "I don't understand what you mean." Lin An said slowly, "A few months ago, when I overused the eye of law, I suddenly awakened a new power. That power is the ability to collapse the law. With the rapid improvement of my strength, my ability to control that power is also improving day by day, but so far, once I transform my eyes into the eyes of Honkai Impact, if I don't pay attention, I will be backlashed by this huge power. Before, my eyes were damaged due to the backlash of this force." As soon as he said this, the face showed a look of shock. Even because of Lin's words, its tree trunks for hundreds of kilometers began to sway. He murmured, "Hankai's power, how is this possible?" You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yitiao Xuanhuan. Chapter 219. He looked at Lin in horror. After knowing that he could control the law, it had been vaguely guessing that Lin An would most likely be a part of that grand plan like it. Or even a more advanced completer. But now, it no longer dares to speculate anymore. He has the ability to construct laws and destroy laws at the same time. What exactly is he? In other words, what do those eyes of his represent? In this era of collapse, what role will he play? It already feels invisible now. It looked at Lin An complicatedly and said, I really didn't expect that you would care about the two terrifying abilities of destruction and creation at the same time. I really can't imagine that one day you will walk on the path of destruction road. What kind of terrible things will happen to this world? You should understand my worries. Lin An was silent for a moment and said slowly, if it were me a few months ago, I would tell you that I would never go to the road of destruction. My destiny is in my own hands. But now, after experiencing this after a series of things, I think I need to understand these two powers from a more objective perspective. I don't want to become a saint, but equally, I don't want to become a demon, so the first thing I have to do is to slowly learn no more over-reliance on these two abilities. I want to control them instead of relying on them. My destiny is in my own hands. The face looked deeply into Lin. Before, after feeling the murderous nature in Lin An's heart, he was full of worries about this man. I even think that he is a demon in this era. But now, its impression of Lin has changed a lot. Being driven by powerful force, he could turn back and stop abruptly at the moment when he was about to lose his original intention. He indeed had the qualifications to become the strongest person of this era. I don't know why, but suddenly, it felt a little relaxed in its heart. Lynette looked deeply at Lin, and suddenly a deep smile appeared on its face and said, if you want to train your mind, maybe I can help you. Lin An's heart moved, she raised her head and said, oh. The big tree swayed its branches and leaves and said, in the deepest part of my torso, there is a sanctuary that existed before my consciousness was condensed. I guess that sanctuary is most likely the existence that planted me in the fairy age and later opened up in my body. Out of the cave? It slowly said, that place has a completely different passage of time from the outside world. Later, the powerful venerable at the end of the fairy era engraved the history of our entire era into it. If you want to train your mind, this is the most suitable place, because nothing can make a person mature and determined more than the accumulation of history and time. A few hours later, in the center of this small world, Lin An and Kameng stood under its thickest tree trunk. They raised their heads and looked at the tree shade that covered the entire sky. Slowly, in front of Lin An, the huge tree trunk slowly opened a crack that only allowed one person to pass through. The crack was very deep and dark. The sound of the big trees sounded from all directions. Lin, go ahead. Only one person is allowed to set foot there. I hope you can get what you want in that cave. Kameng looked at the cave with some worry, couldn't help but grabbed Lin An's wrist and said, Lin. Lin shook his head, his face full of determination. Don't worry, I'll be fine. If I can really control the murderous nature in my heart, it will be a great benefit to both me and you. Kameng originally wanted to say something, but looking at Lin An's expression, she did not continue to dissuade him. She knew that once Lin An did something, he would do it with all his strength. Lin, you have to be careful. Kameng nodded. Lin An took off the cloth from his eyes, opened his purple eyes, and said, if the passage of time inside is really very different from the outside world, I will not leave for too long. After I come back, we will return to the Kyushu territory as soon as possible. We have been away for too long, and a lot must have happened in the outside world. Change. After saying that, he strode towards the dark cave. Voiceless, half-dream, are they okay now? King Ian must have been waiting for him in Jianghai City, and Banmen must have left the wasteland and returned to the Chen family. I have really been gone for too long. It wasn't that he didn't want to go back early, but after experiencing the last murderous outbreak, he had a vague feeling that if the murderous intention controlled him again, he might even kill the people around him. For the person he loves most, This is simply a disaster within a disaster. Wait for me, I will come to see you soon, Banmen, Kingian. The next moment, in the deepest part of the dark cave, Lin slowly opened his eyes. After being blinded for nearly a month, seeing things again now really gives people a completely new feeling. Lin En said slowly, I'm here. Where is the cave you mentioned? In the darkness, the ethereal sound of the big tree came. That's where you are now, but this cave is different from the real cave. When you step into it, you have actually stepped into the history of the entire fairy era. The next moment, accompanied by a huge light, Lin En suddenly closed his eyes, and the next moment, when he opened his eyes again, everything around him had changed. He found himself standing in an ancient city, surrounded by people wearing strange clothes. Everything was unreal, like a dream, as if at that moment, he had traveled to another completely different era. Have you heard? Not long ago, a woman with the surname Ji won the first place in the competition of the 8 sex, beating hundreds of geniuses. The 2 umbrellas in her hands are powerful spiritual weapons that are rare in 1,000 years. In my opinion, another extraordinary genius is about to rise. A few days ago in the eastern wilderness, there were thousands of divine lights and strange phenomena. According to speculation from various sects, there is a high possibility that a great evil that does not exist in our time has awakened there. Many major sects in the East attach great importance to this matter. Also, have you heard? The world tree that has been standing in the Middle Earth since ancient times has developed spiritual intelligence. This incident has caused a shock to all the major sects in the Middle Earth. I have heard that many beings that have been sleeping for thousands of years have been awakened. The world tree has given birth to spirits. Does this indicate that something big is about to happen? Lin En stared at everything around him in a daze, and heard many discussions in his ears. Those things that were completely out of his time reminded him that this was no longer the world he was familiar with. Lin En looked at his hands and murmured, "Where is this place?" The voice of the tree of life came to his ears. "This is a microcosm of the 3,000 years of history since I woke up. It is the node where the end of the fairy era is about to come. This is the historical precipitation of the end of the fairy era." Lin En raised his head and said, "In other words, is all this an illusion?" The voice said deeply, "It seems like an illusion, but it is not an illusion. It seems like a dream, but it is not a dream. Who can tell? I hope that these 3,000 years of vanity can wash away the impetuousness in your heart and let your mind settle down. I can see the laws of things." Author, Yitiao Xuanhuan. Chapter 220. The noisy voices were like the rolling red dust flowing by. At this moment, he finally realized how uncomfortable it was to feel separated from the times, as Dei said. This feeling of being out of tune with everything around made people feel confused. Lin En walked with the crowd, flashy and dreamy. At this moment, a hurried red figure came from the crowd. With a scream, she bumped into Lin En's shoulder. Lin En subconsciously reached out and grabbed her wrist, but was startled in his heart. Is this really a dream? The woman in red stood up quickly, looked at Lin En, bowed, and apologized. "I'm sorry, I was in a hurry, I'm really sorry." Lin En asked, "Can you see me?" The woman blinked, looked at Lin En in confusion, tilted her head and said, "Of course, I really didn't mean to bump into you." Lin En was startled in his heart, raised his head and looked at the bustling crowd, like a fantasy. Is this really a dream? If it was a dream, how could it be so real? Your clothes are so strange, you are not a local, are you also attracted by the revival of the world tree? Looking at Lin En's silent expression, the red-dressed woman turned her eyes, a cunning flashed in her eyes, and said, "Meeting is fate, my name is Yi, what about you?" Lin En looked at her hand, his eyes were dazed, he subconsciously stretched out his hand and said, "My name is Lin En." Outside the big tree that stretched for hundreds of miles, Chi Meng waited in front of the deep tree whole day and night, waiting for Lin En's return. From morning to night, when she was sleepy, she leaned against the tree trunk to sleep, and when she was thirsty, she drank some dew on the leaves. Chi Meng stayed there all the time. I don't know how long it has been, it seems like countless years, but it seems like only a few days. She looked up at the towering tree, half knelt there with her hands clasped together, and whispered. Whether it is God or the gods, I hope you can bless Lin En to return safely, protect him and let him really get what he wants. We have suffered too much. She opened her eyes and looked at the deep cave, her eyelashes drooping slightly. This month or so was like a dream to her. Although she knew that they would definitely not stay in this paradise for the rest of their lives, she couldn't help but think about it sometimes. If they could stay here together forever, maybe they would be very happy. 3 days had passed. And just as she was praying, suddenly, she saw a ray of light slowly coming from the dark gap of the tree. She was startled and stood up quickly. The next moment, Lin En slowly walked out of it. Lin En, Chi Meng looked happy, and rushed over quickly and threw herself into Lin En's arms. How is it? 3 days have passed. What did you experience in there? Until being hugged by Chi Meng, the light in Lin En's eyes slowly revived. Lin En stared at Chi Meng's face in a daze and said, "It seems that I have returned to reality." Chi Meng looked into his eyes, and faintly, she felt an inexplicable breath on Lin En's body. Although he looked no different from 3 days ago, the feeling he gave people was completely different. The sharp breath on his body was almost completely gone, replaced by a heavy vicissitudes. Especially his eyes, as if they had been precipitated for endless years, strange and familiar. Lin En. Chi Meng stared at him in a daze. Lin En came back to his senses, a smile appeared on his face, and the vicissitudes on his body slowly converged, as if he had returned to his original appearance. But the change in the soul was already very different. I'm fine. He turned his head and looked at the ancient tree, and said slowly. Thank you for letting me experience that era. It is indeed worthy of being called the great dream of eternity. This dream has brought me a lot. The wind blew the leaves, and the whole tree swayed in the wind. The old voice came. 3,000 years, Lin En, I really never thought that in that illusory historical fantasy, you could still grow against the sky, and the entire Dharma ending period has become your own stage. Lin En raised his head and said, everyone is full of yearning for the pinnacle of power, but when you really stand at that peak, the scenery there is actually not as beautiful as imagined, but just walking this road again in reality. He said slowly, I believe I can leave now. Lin En turned around, grabbed Chi Meng's wrist, and walked towards the entrance of the small world without looking back. He walked steadily and did not look back. If he was like a sharp sword before, now he is more like a calm Taishan. The big tree had been watching Lin En's departure from afar, and let out a long sigh. In the dream of eternity, he spent 3 days experiencing the past of 3,000 years. In that illusory era, he kept wandering in the world, experienced the separation of life and death, experienced the love of children, and finally stood at the top of that era. But even though he was already powerful and invincible, when the end of the world came, all that was left was eternal loneliness. Was it really a dream? Maybe, not completely. A gust of wind blew, and this small world regained its past tranquility. Lin En and Chi Meng slowly walked out of the cave, and the fresh air from the outside world immediately hit them. Lin En couldn't help but take a deep breath, and the whole person relaxed. Chi Meng was hesitant to speak all the way, but Lin En remained silent, and she had no time to ask. At this time, she finally couldn't help but want to ask. Lin En, what did you see there? She asked in confusion. She was indeed very curious. Lin En smiled slightly, looked at the sky and said, I have seen the ups and downs of 3,000 years, and experienced it myself. I started as an ordinary person and experienced 3,000 worlds, but for me, those are just a dream. Chi Meng stared at his profile in a daze and said, 3,000 years, you have successfully trained your mind, right? Lin An smiled and said, maybe. Chi Meng cheered, hugged his shoulders and said, great. Lin An smiled and shook his head, then stretched out his hand to the sky and said, let's go, we have been away from Zhuzhu for too long, and no one knows what changes have taken place in Zhuzhu. Lin An said slowly, my sword, your master is back.